The year was 1971. The Cold War was at its peak. Both the US and the Soviet Union wanted to edge the other. They were willing to do anything for it, even compromise on ideology. In July that year, the US made a breakthrough. Their national security advisor was Henry Kissinger. He landed in Pakistan for talks. But his real mission was something else. Kissinger lied to the press. He said he was ill and he wanted a break. Maybe travel to a hill station, that's what he told the media. Then at 3 a.m., he left for the airport. A Pakistani diplomat drove him personally. Apparently, he did not trust his chauffeur to get the job done. At the airport, a plane was waiting for him. It would take Kissinger over the Himalayas to China. Not without incident, though. Chinese officials were inside the plane waiting for Kissinger, but Kissinger's American secret agents had no clue about them. Their first reaction was enemies. So the American agents drew their guns. Thankfully, there was no standoff. Kissinger traveled successfully to Beijing and met China's top leaders. It led to decades of close ties between the US and China. But none of this may have been possible without Pakistan. Their president, Yahya Khan, played a key role. He was like the middleman. He took messages from China, relayed them to Washington. You could say Pakistan was a window to China. Today, of course, it has changed. China does not need a window anymore, yet it continues to support Pakistan. As their leaders say, the friendship is higher than mountains, deeper than the oceans, and sweeter than honey. But how did it reach this stage? How did China and Pakistan become iron brothers? Time for a flashback. China and the Indian subcontinent. Two massive geographies, two massive populations. You would expect their history to be full of conflicts and exchanges. But strangely, that's not the case, because between them is a huge wall, the mountains of the Himalayas. So exchanges between the subcontinent and China were few. Both sides knew very little of each other. And most of that came via the Silk Road. We're talking about an ancient trade route. It connected Eurasia to East Asia. Both Pakistan and China were important stops on this route. But then came technology, flights, railways, phones, telegrams. Suddenly, the mountains were not a problem. That's when Pakistan and China got to know each other. Let's begin from the 20th century. In 1949, the communists won the civil war in China. Mao Zedong declared a People's Republic. Immediately, all communist nations recognized the new regime. Among the rest, the non-communists, India was the first to recognize China. And pretty soon, Pakistan followed. In 1950, Pakistan recognized communist China. It was the first Muslim nation to do so. At this point, Islamabad was still figuring out its policy. One man would play a key role in that. Pakistan's first Prime Minister, Liaquat Ali Khan. He liked the idea of non-alignment. 3 days after Pakistan's creation, Liaquat gave an interview. He said Pakistan was not interested in ideological conflicts. His actions also suggested that. First, he established ties with the Soviet Union. Then he recognized China. But Liaquat Ali Khan was assassinated in 1951, so Pakistan only flirted with non-alignment. It never led to anything concrete. And by the second half of the 1950s, it was too late. Pakistan's civilian leaders had become considerably weak, so the army took their place. These generals took Islamabad closer to the west. They signed 2 military pacts with the US. In 1954, the SEATO, the Southeast Asia Treaty Organization, and in 1955, CENTO, the Central Treaty Organization. Think of these as NATO light. As Pakistan became a Western military ally, it was a big put-off for China. After all, Beijing was then allied with the Soviet Union, but the 1960s brought good news. Some major realignments happened. First, China split with the Soviet Union. They had some border issues going on. Plus, Moscow feared that China would challenge its leadership in the communist bloc. So the two sides broke up. And this gave Pakistan a window. At that point, Beijing was like the new kid in school. So Pakistan showed him around, introduced him to all the other kids in class, like the United States in the West or Saudi Arabia in West Asia. That was the first big realignment. The second was the India-China war. In the 1950s, everyone was talking about Hindi Chini Bhai Bhai, the so-called brotherhood between Indians and Chinese. But that lie was busted in 1962. China and India fought a war over the border. Suddenly, Beijing and Islamabad had one more thing in common. a shared enemy in India. After the war, China and Pakistan struck a deal, the Sino-Pak Agreement of 1963. It was sort of like a land swap, an illegal land swap. China gave up almost 2,000 square kilometers of land to Pakistan. In exchange, Pakistan recognized China's claims over parts of Kashmir and Ladakh. We are talking about Indian land here, but Pakistan and China decided to carve it up. 2 years later, another war broke out. Pakistan sensed that India was weak after the 1962 defeat. So they thought, now is the time to attack. And China supported them. Beijing openly sided with Pakistan's government. They accused India of quote-unquote naked aggression. China also beefed up its security at the border with India. It was like a warning to New Delhi, a reminder that China could open a second front. Eventually, the United Nations Security Council stepped in. They forced an end to the fighting, though by then, India had the upper hand. This war also shaped Pakistan's thinking about the US and China. The US did not support Pakistan's war. In fact, they imposed an embargo on them. But China was all in. So Islamabad came to the logical conclusion that China is reliable and America is not. That thinking extended to the 1970s. China supported Pakistan's position on Kashmir. In return, Pakistan brokered China's reset with the US. It became a nexus of three. And we saw that during the 1971 war, the Chinese and the Americans supported Pakistan. Washington even urged China to intervene militarily. But for whatever reason, Beijing did not. Now, India was seeing this alliance grow, this new axis of Pakistan and China. And it's one of the reasons India developed a nuclear weapon to defend against both sides. In response, Pakistan tried to make its own, and guess who helped them? China. In 1982, a Pakistani plane took off from China's Urumqi. Inside it were the ingredients for a bomb, 5 stainless steel boxes of weapons-grade uranium. That's almost 50 kilograms of it. Also a blueprint on how to make a bomb. China had already tested a nuke in the 1960s, so they gave the plan to Pakistan. It was like those craft classes in school. The teacher would give you some materials, they would draw a design on the board, and you would then have to recreate it. Except here, it was a weapon of mass destruction. In the 1990s, Pakistan began putting it all together. They made between 7 and 12 warheads. Of course, China does not admit to any of this. Neither does the US, which knew what was happening. In the 1980s, Washington needed Pakistan's help in Afghanistan, so they allowed China to help Islamabad. Which brings us to present day. China-Pakistan relations are at an unprecedented high, again because of a realignment. Pakistan knows it cannot take on India. It is no match, militarily or economically. So Islamabad has always counted on a security guarantor, someone who can be their godfather. In the first decades after partition, Pakistan chose the US, and the Americans played along. After all, India was closer to the Soviet Union, so helping Pakistan made sense for them. But after the Cold War, that equation changed. America drew closer to India, so Pakistan needed a new godfather, someone who shared a rivalry with India. Enter China. They have replaced the US as Pakistan's top arms supplier. Warships, fighter jets, missiles, you name it, and China has given it to Pakistan. And what do they get in return? A low-cost deterrent. China has invested some $60 billion in Pakistan. Now, that may sound like a lot of money, especially since most projects have not even taken off. But this investment is not just financial, it is strategic. For $60 billion, China can irritate India, keep the Indian army engaged, maybe open a second front if conflict breaks out. So from that perspective, the investment is good. Also, Pakistan is good real estate. It has a long border with Iran. It also has direct access to the Indian Ocean. So Beijing's bet makes strategic sense. But they got one thing wrong. They underestimated Pakistan's ability to self-destruct, to squander money and influence. Will it be enough to break the Iron Brotherhood, though? As they say, only time will tell.